All right, so now we're ready to start for real. All right, that was just a practice run, you know, like me singing things to make sure I'm enunciating properly. So what I'm going to be doing is making a filament holder for a filament spool, because I have a 3D printing class I have in mind, and I want to actually have some filament holders for those 3D printers as well. Now, I could 3D print them, but if I'm going to be making a lot of them, that's going to take a really long time. Now it's time that I don't have to be doing anything, but it's still a lot of time. So I would rather just laser them out, because I have a feeling that this kind of lasering project, the actual cut time is probably going to be around 2 minutes or so. So that's a lot faster than waiting 6 hours for a 3D print. So I can kind of hammer that out pretty quickly. So what I've done already is I've kind of modeled the spool. And that's supposed to be the thickness of the spool. So this dimension is 2 5/8 inches. Apologies to anybody who's into metric units. Most of the stuff at Home Depot is sold in imperial units, so we're going to stick with that. And I've also modeled at least the size of this board. And probably most importantly, I've measured the thickness of it, because if I want things to really fit together perfectly, I need to get that thickness right. And there is some variation. So at certain points, it was like 0.199, but at other points, it was 0.202. I took the largest one because I really would like this to fit a little bit, not super snug, but snug enough that like a little bit of glue will hold it together perfectly. So, and by the way, this is just Baltic birch plywood. Home Depot bought it in 2 foot by 4 foot sheets. Get a lot of it. Okay, so why don't I sketch kind of what I'm thinking first, because I always like to have some sort of sketch to refer back to. It's basically how I avoid making dumb thinking mistakes, which I'm prone to. So I'm thinking that it'll look a little bit like an A-frame, so something like this. Sketches don't have to be good, by the way. The spool will be something like that. And let's cut off this top piece. And we're going to have a little notch in there that a cross piece will go through, that this spool will actually hang on. So basically, it'll look like a piece coming through like this.
Like a tape dispenser?
Yeah, a little bit like a tape dispenser, yeah. Except without the little ripping section. Because that would be too hard to model, and it would not work very well with PLA. And then I'm thinking that we'll have cross pieces in here somewhere. So if I'm looking at this from the side view, I've got the spool, got the side pieces like this. Like I said, sketches don't have to be good, which is fortunate because my drawing skills are bad. And then something like that. So those would be the cross pieces right here. I have a couple of decisions to make at this point. I could make it where the tabs to connect here are right on the edge, but then I'm really relying on glue. There's not any sort of, it's not kinematically constrained. I'm sure I'm misusing that word. But I'm going to have to glue it in order for those joints to stay stuck together. So instead, I'm actually going to inset those just a little bit so that I have physical material blocking it on all sides of those tabs. Now, I could also do a lot of thinking about, well, which one do I really want to have the tabs going into? Do I want to have it where I've got the side pieces and the tabs are sticking through like that? Or do I want to do it the other way around, where the side pieces are actually sticking through the end pieces? It actually doesn't look that different now that I'm drawing it. So obviously one of these is supposed to be rotated. But the idea is that I could choose basically which piece fits into which other piece. And I'm thinking that these shorter pieces, the ones that are going into the board in this orientation, those are the ones that I want to be sticking into these A-shaped pieces.
Tab A, slot B, so to speak?
So to speak, right. And then I'll probably just remove some material here just to make it look cool or something like that. Basically totally aesthetic. I'd actually probably do something like that instead. That looks sleeker. But whatever you want to do, that's fine. You don't even have to block, you don't have to remove that material if you don't want. And I'm also thinking that I'm going to chamfer or fillet these two edges so that it's a little easier to slot that piece down into it. So that cross piece will be easy to get in there. I don't have to get it like perfectly adjusted. And I may even want to give a little bit of extra play there, so that this thickness is not actually the thickness of my material. It's maybe a little bit larger, a couple of thousandths bigger. So I'm ready to go ahead and start designing some stuff. So now we'll get to the fun part. But this will keep me from making a lot of mistakes later on. It won't keep me from making all the mistakes.
So you're just making the stand. You're not making the spool.
Correct.
Okay. That's what I was confused by. I thought you were making the spool out of the Baltic birch.
Ah, you know, I could do that, but it would not be particularly fun. Okay, so I've got Inkscape open, and remember this is more of a seminar, so you probably won't be able to keep up. I'm going to be doing some stuff really fast. It's being recorded, so you should be able to watch it again later. You can slow it down, you can pause it and do the same thing, all that, but I'm going to try and talk through what I'm doing. If you see things that don't make sense, just pipe up, ask a question, particularly if that question will make me look good, and we'll go from there. All right, so I've got Inkscape open. The first thing I'm going to do is actually save my file, because I can't tell you how many times I've forgotten, and then it's been very frustrating. So I'm going to call this spool holder, because I have a vivid imagination. All right. Next thing I'm going to do is that I currently have a page border, so a page border right here, and that's just an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, which is what a lot of people are designing for, but that's not what I'm designing for. I'm designing for this board right here, and so I'd rather actually have that page border reflect this. Not that it's going to impact any part of the design, but it'll give me a good feel for like how big this stuff is. Is it going to fit on one sheet? Because if it's too large, I'll be able to tell at this stage rather than waiting until I go to print it and saying, oh, that doesn't fit, and then it'll be very embarrassing. So what I'm going to do is go to Document Properties, and it always shows up on the side. I'm going to change these units to inches, and I'm going to call the width, that's 18 inches, so we'll type in 18, and the height will be 10 inches. Press enter, and there we go. And I'm going to save. So I do Control S a whole lot. I almost do it compulsively. It's probably a problem, but I'm okay with that. Okay, so what I'm thinking we should do first is actually model the spool so that we can design stuff around it. A lot of the way that I'm designing things is to get around having to dimension things specifically, and the whole reason I use Inkscape is so that I can do that more effectively. If I was using 2D CAD, it would be hard to just kind of rough out what I wanted it to look like. And it's a lot harder to deal with offsetting for the kerf, the thickness of the laser, if you're using CAD. And I can explain more about that later, but it is what it is. So I'm going to start with the circle tool, and I'm just going to click and drag to make a circle. Here's where I'm going to make a little bit of a change. I'm going to go to Object and open this Fill and Stroke menu on the right. Fill is basically the border, or sorry, fill is the inside part, and the stroke is the border. So I actually want this to have a fill. Make it slightly opaque, this little A thing at the bottom, that controls the opacity. And at some point you're going to put items on top of each other, and you're going to lose sight of them and have no idea where everything is. It's a lot easier if you just make it where you can see through all of the items. So we've got that, and I'm going to get rid of the stroke because that will impact my dimensions, and I actually don't want it to impact my dimensions. I want to draw this so that it's exactly the size I want it to be, so that when I offset for the thickness of the laser, it ends up being the right size. Now you may notice that I just kind of drew a random, it's not even really a circle, it's more of an ellipse. Actually, it's close enough to a circle that it might trick you into thinking it's a circle, but it's an ellipse. You can tell up at the top, you see this width and this height, W and H. Those are the width and height in millimeters, but I'm going to change that to inches. I'm probably going to end up doing that a lot tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to 7 7/8, so 7.875. Did I do that math right? So that I actually have the size of the spool. All right. And I could draw another circle, but I am super lazy, so I'm just going to click Control D and duplicate it. And you'll notice that it got a tiny bit darker. It's because now there are two on top of each other. So you can kind of see a little change in how dark they are. And I'm going to click this little lock button to lock the aspect ratio, so I don't have to type in two numbers now. I can just type in one and it'll stay a circle. And we'll do 2 1/8, so 2.125. Of course, it's not in the right place at all. So I have a couple of options for getting it in the center, because that was basically the center hole of the spool. I could use the Align and Distribute menu, and we'll probably use that at some point, but I'm going to be super lazy and select these snaps that show up on the right hand side of mine, but they may show up on the top on your version of Inkscape. And I want to be able to snap it to bounding boxes, and I want it to be able to snap to the center of bounding boxes, so that when I click and drag this, hey, it snaps right to the middle. So I don't have to worry about any of that dimensioning business. Snaps are wonderful. Control S. All right, so we now have the spool. And actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these two, and I actually want to make this into one item so that I don't click and drag it off to the side and get them all mixed up at some point later on. So I'm going to go to Path and click Difference. And it's basically just taking the item that was on top, which was the smaller circle, and cutting it out of the one below it. At some point, you're going to use difference, and everything's going to disappear. That's because the bigger thing was on top. So it was trying to subtract the thing on top from the thing underneath it, and it said, oh, perfect. There's nothing now. All right, that's easy to remember. So just wanted you to know that that's coming. I'm actually not going to do this on all the things that I'm going to design to fit together. I actually want the inside cuts to be separate items, and you'll see why later on. All right? But for now, we're going to leave it like this. I could also set this as a separate layer. That's probably the best way to do it. I'm going to avoid doing that because I think this design is going to end up being relatively simple, so I don't feel that that's necessarily necessary. That's redundant. But I don't feel like I need to do that, so I'm going to leave that part out. All right, but I am going to send it to the bottom. See these little things up here? These actually control where things are in that stack. So I really want this to be way at the bottom because I'd like to not select it. In almost every case, it's going to default to selecting whatever's on top rather than what's underneath. Okay, so we've got that. Now is the stressful part, because you got to figure out where do I even start making this thing. So I'm thinking that I'm going to start by making a rectangle for this bottom piece. So I'll grab the rectangle tool, and this is where all that snapping is going to be really useful. Because in theory it should snap to the side, but it looks like I didn't snap to the midpoints of bounding box. So I'll select that one, and sometimes Inkscape is mean. It's like, no, you gotta unselect everything for that snap to show up. It's still not showing up, because it's being mean. So I'm just going to do a randomly sized box, and I'll show you something else instead. I'm going to mash escape so that I get back to the select tool. What I'm going to do is click Control C to copy this, and we'll see if I can actually paste size. Hey, that worked out. So what I was doing was I took the size, the width, and the height of this piece, and I copied it, and then I pasted it to this other thing. So now this is exactly the same size as the other piece, which is just kind of cool. Like, it's not terribly useful very often, but sometimes it really is. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to shrink this a little bit. Actually, you know what? We'll leave it full size. So I'll do Control Z. And we're going to shift it down a little bit. Maybe something like, that looks good to me. We're going to end up chamfering off these corners so that we get that kind of A-looking thing. And we'll go from there.
Do you worry about the fact that you're already off your piece of wood?
So that's a good question. One thing is that I'm not actually going to be cutting the spool. So really, it's more like that.
Okay.
So I do have a fair amount of room. But that is a good thing to point out. And I'm actually going to change the color of this because this is going to be something I care about. We'll change it to like a bluish tint, which still doesn't really register. We'll try to make it a little bluer. Ooh, that's way worse.
With,
Right.
with Inkscape, does it, I guess, have it in layers, the different elements, or is it just you have to keep track of it on your own?
You can put it in layers. So there's a layer menu, this layer tab up here. You click on the bottom, you can click layers. Right now it just has everything in layer 1.
Okay.
Everything does have a position in the stack, so like some things are higher up than others, even within a layer.
Okay.
Right now I'm trying to keep everything above this circle, but at some point I'm going to mess that up. because that's what happens, and I'll just end up having to shift things up and down so I can select what I want to select.
Okay.
There are probably keyboard shortcuts for that. There are definitely keyboard shortcuts for that. I definitely don't know them yet. Okay. So I like the way this looks so far, but I haven't done anything with actual dimensions yet. So I'm just going to create a new box, and I'm going to change the width of this to be the thickness of my material. So I'm going to set that to, we're going to get rid of that aspect ratio thing because that's no longer useful. So 0.202, pretty darn thin. And I'm going to snap that in there because I want that slot to be right in there, because there's going to be a cross piece that goes in there. And I'm going to duplicate that, move it down to the corners, and duplicate it again, move it to the other corners. And this is looking good so far. I'm starting to feel like I may have made this too tall, so I'm going to shrink it a little bit. See, this is one of the nice things about working in Inkscape. It doesn't matter that the dimensions or whatever, because I just say, that doesn't look very good, so I'll change it so that it looks better. And everything can snap to everything else. So you see how I'm just kind of haphazardly putting those in the corners. That is not visible at all. You guys are supposed to tell me this stuff.
Can't see it very well, Kevin.
Thank you, Stuart.
I'm here for you, dude.
I knew I could count on you. Okay, all right, so we've got at least a feel for where things are roughly going to be. However, you remember how I said I wanted these to be a little bit, I wanted them to be a little inset, so there's material blocking it. So that like the pieces going into the board from here actually will fit in there. So what I'm going to do is, I could do this several ways. I'm going to close this layer menu. But probably the easiest way is I'm actually going to duplicate this again, and I'm going to inset it basically the thickness of the material. So I'm going to just slide that over. And I'm going to zoom in because I see that I overlapped them. And so we'll just pull it out a little more. At this point, I'm going to delete this one because it's going to be really confusing having those two there. It's going to look like one. We don't want to deal with any of that business. We'll duplicate this one, basically replicate that same thing. I really shouldn't be duplicating it like this, because really I should just do it all on one side first, and then copy it all over to the other side, so that instead of duplicating stuff, I'm like mirroring it over. But you all forgive me, right? Okay. Okay.
And those are representative of the slots that you're going to insert the tabs into from the cross pieces.
Exactly.
So they'll be empty. They'll be cut
Well,
out when you're done.
Sort of. So let's actually get to that now. This still feels like it's too tall to me. I don't know why, but that feels too tall. So I'm still gonna. Oops, I shifted it. That's gonna happen at some point. You'll shift something and not realize it, and then stress happens after that. So what we're gonna do is, now it's gonna be tricky. So I'm actually gonna duplicate this. I'm going to push it a little bit down so that I can grab these two pieces on top of it. And I'm going to move this up. The reason I duplicated it was so that I could grab all of these without having to reposition them and scoot them all up using the snaps. Now I can delete that spare. So basically what I was doing was I was saying I could move this around really precisely. I could use the transform menu, which if you go to object, go down to transform, you can just move things horizontally or vertically a certain amount. I was just like, I just feel like kind of moving it up a little bit. So that's all I did. Now these are starting to intersect with the circle. So what I'm going to do is grab them both and shrink them down a little bit. Ta-da! So pretty straightforward. Okay. So these are the height of those cross pieces, so the pieces going into the board. And I'm going to leave them like this, but I need to actually make the tabs. So the way I'm going to make the tabs is by more duplicating. I'm going to use duplicate a lot. I hope you're all comfortable with that. So we're going to grab these, and I'm going to duplicate it. So duplicate. And I'm going to make it a good deal smaller. Now it gets really annoying that things are snapping. So I'm going to zoom in using the scroll wheel. I don't know, let's make it that big. Everybody comfortable with that big? Okay. We're going to duplicate it again, as I'm sure you all saw coming. And slide this down. Really, I'd like to slide it down along the vertical axis because I want them still to be lined up. So I'm holding the control button to get at them to do that. I'm actually just going to move them down like this, basically stacking 3 of them together. And then I'm going to delete that middle one. So I have 2 tabs that are going to be sticking through. But they're not where I want them to be. So what I'll do is I'll grab them both, and I'm going to group them using Control G. And this is going to allow me to line them relative to other things, but they as a block will actually be centered on other things. Can everybody see that? Okay. My mouse is jumping around. It must be nervous. It doesn't get to see very many people. All right, so I'm going to now drag this down and snap it to the middle. And so now it's centered on those things, but it's kind of a neat looking setup. So we're going to change this color a little bit because I do feel like we're going to ungroup it and then change the fill to maybe, no, that didn't help. What if we make it really dark? It's not helping. All right, I need to change this one. This one needs to be way lighter. That's a little better, right? You can tell me if it's not.
Well, it's getting harder to see the background versus that.
You're right. We should make
Video.
the background really light.
There you go.
That would make a lot more sense. So now it's almost kind of a ghostly background. All right, so we've got these pieces. I'm going to go back to grouping them, and then I'm going to duplicate them to move them over here. And snap them to the midpoint of that piece too. Now at this point, we don't really need these pieces, the bigger vertical parts. I'm going to leave them just so I can get a feel for where things are. I really want this to almost look like I'm doing a cross-section view. If I was doing CAD, it's like a cross-section view, and then I'm going to copy the whole thing and delete out the stuff I don't need when I'm going to actually make my parts that I want to cut. All right, that'll make a lot more sense later on. We should have had like a counter going for like how many times do I press Control S, because you can tell up in the top right whenever it has an asterisk, that means I haven't saved. And so be on the lookout for that. We'll actually be able to go and watch and see how many times I save compulsively. Okay, so I've got a couple of other things to deal with. I know that it's actually kind of hard for me to now click on this middle piece. I'm grabbing just the whole rectangle, so I'm going to grab this rectangle and send it down a couple layers so that I can grab this middle piece. So now what I'm designing is this little notch right here. So to me that is way too large vertically, so we'll make that a little bit smaller. I'm also going to shift it down, and it doesn't want me to snap on there quite as nicely, so we'll hold off on that for a second. And what I'll do, this is where it would have been helpful for me to leave those as 2 separate parts, because right now it's going to be very hard for me to position it perfectly. I could zoom in and I could just grab this one and basically do it by eye, which is actually what I'm going to do, because like it's going to work out just fine just doing it by eye. This is not something where I need it to be really, really accurate. You may have noticed that I also left a lot of play right here in between the spool and the actual frame. That way I don't really have to be quite as precise. I'm leaving a little bit of play because that's probably not the only kind of spool I'm ever going to deal with. Some of the spools may be larger or smaller, so having some wiggle room, I could probably actually put more wiggle room than I put in this one, but we're going to leave it as is. Having some wiggle room makes a lot of sense. All right. So we've got that there. I'm actually going to make this maybe a little bit smaller vertically. So maybe something like that. Just in case I run into some spools that have a smaller inner diameter. Now the one thing I haven't mentioned or haven't really talked about is that I wanted this to be ever so slightly bigger than that notch. That way it would fit in like really nicely rather than me having to like force fit it in. Because I want the tabs to like force fit in. I don't want this piece to force fit in because I'm going to pull that in and out whenever I change my spool. So let's make it a little bit wider, but before I make it wider, I want to be able to center the new widened piece in this exact same spot. So I could do that a couple of different ways. I could duplicate it, make it a little bit wider, and then snap it to the original one and delete the original one. But I'm also realizing that it is centered relative to this piece. So I think I'm actually going to use the Align and Distribute menu instead. So what we'll do is we'll make this a little bit wider. I don't know, we'll say like 0.006 of an inch. So we'll call it 0.208, which isn't going to look like things changed. I'm actually not comfortable with that. We'll just make it a nice 0.21.
Okay, so you're doing that, but,
Doesn't look like much is changing.
well, no. So, but what about the laser curve?
So we're going to deal with that way later on,
Okay.
rather than trying to deal with that right now. Right now, this is the reason that I got rid of all of the stroke lines, because I don't want it to even look like I'm lasering it just yet.
Okay.
When we go to laser it, I will end up putting back a stroke back on, setting that stroke to the thickness of the laser.
Because the stroke, the stroke is the cut.
If you set it to the thickness of the laser, yes. So the cut of the laser goes right along the center line of that stroke, which coincides with the boundaries of the shaded regions.
So when we have no stroke, though, there's no lasering.
That's a good question. So it's not necessarily that there's no lasering, and this may be different for other lasers, but at least with the Glowforge, it will default to showing up as an engrave in the UI if you don't have a stroke set.
Okay.
That's not necessarily a problem because you can switch it to a cut, and it'll work just fine. But why not just have it default to being a cut if it's a cut? Because at some point, you'll have it set to an engrave and not realize it, and you'll set it to like really low speed and maximum power, and it's just going to burn a gigantic hole in your material rather than cutting through like you'd intended it to.
So when we look at this, because there's no stroke, it's just filled to the edge.
Right. And it's filled to the center line of where the stroke would be.
Okay.
So I could actually demonstrate that. Let's grab this piece right here. What we'll do is we will turn on the stroke. We'll make it black, and then we'll make this huge.
Okay, and the dotted line in the middle of it.
Right. So watch what happens when I turn off the stroke. You see the fill goes to the center line of the stroke rather than to the inner or outer border. So not totally critical for understanding any of this, but you know, it's interesting to note. Okay, so I made this part, but it's not centered, so I'm going to hold Shift and select that rectangle. And then I'm going to go to the Object menu and open this AlignDistribute menu over here. And the order that I select those in matters a lot, because right here it says relative to last selected. So it's going to move everything relative to the last piece that was selected. So for me, that was the bigger piece, and that is the one that I want to move relative to. And I'm going to center it on the vertical axis. And it's not going to look like it moved, but trust me, it moved ever so slightly. I could center it on the horizontal axis, but that's clearly not what I want to do. So I'm going to click Control Z and then Control S while I'm thinking about it. So now this is centered, even though it doesn't look like it did anything special. It is centered on the piece. And so we've got that notch that we wanted. But we don't have these angled pieces. We don't have that fillet or a chamfer. So let's go ahead and add all of those things. The first thing I'm going to do is grab this outer box, and I'm going to pull it down just to the top of this piece. And it should be snapping there, but it's just disliking me for some reason. So we'll try and just click all those snaps. There we go. So now it's at the same height as this little groove. Okay, so we've got that, and I keep selecting the spool, which means I need to push it to the bottom again so that I can stop selecting the spool. All right. Now there are a couple of ways we could make that edge. So one way is that we go to this stars and polygons tool, and we set the corners to 3, which means a rectangle. Sorry, triangle. I'm still working on my geometry. And now when I do this, it actually creates a triangle, which may work. Let's make it a little bit easier to see. So there's that triangle. And what I could do is I could just take this triangle, just kind of snap it on there somewhere, and we'll scoot it over a little bit So it looks kind of like that, and we would subtract it. So let me pull this. I'm going to make this a little bit fatter. I'll make it a little bit wider. And actually, if I hold, I believe it's shift. There we go. Now it's not just moving to the side, it's actually expanding in place. So I could do something like that. And then I could take this, and I'm actually going to duplicate both of these pieces and move them off so that it'll be easier to see what I'm doing. And I'll make sure this one's on top, and then I'll just click path and difference. And now it cut out that little corner.
Could you have done it with a line tool of some sort, or?
You could, but that will be very tedious. So it is possible, but you would still end up bounding some sort of region and using that difference tool. Now, of course, the question is, great, we got one side, but then how do we do the other?
Yes.
And it turns out that's actually a lot easier than you think. I just click duplicate, Control D, and then I mirror it. And then I have to subtract one from the other, and we'll just see. We'll roll the difference.
And to do the subtract, you had to select the two of them?
Yes. So difference probably was the wrong choice. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these two together, and I'm going to do division. What that did is it took one of them and basically used it as a die to cut the one below it, which meant that it split this into two pieces. Oops. So I can just delete that extra piece, and now I've got that A-frame that I wanted. Does that make sense to everybody?
When you did it, though, and it may just have been how quickly you were doing it, it looked like it took away the right side immediately, and then you had to take away the left. But it could be that I just somehow missed something.
So what happened,
Okay.
I basically started with, I cut off that corner
Yeah.
using that triangle tool and difference. Then I grabbed both of them together. It's not obvious that I have both of them selected. And I used this division thing. But note, I used difference first and that didn't work, and then I decided to use something else. So it's not like I knew ahead of time that division was going to be the right one to do. And division basically uses one as a cookie cutter to cut the one below it. So division, it took one of them, basically the one that had the corner on this side, and cut it out. Which meant that I was left with the original piece minus that little corner. And now I can just delete that extra corner, and now I have that A-frame that I wanted. Now we probably don't need this stuff, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, and I'm going to do that alignment tool, and I'm just going to delete that original outer border. So that now, is that visible? That's actually more visible on the screen than it is on my screen, which is weird. Do Control S. Alright, so I got that little A-frame thing, right? So we're making progress. This little tab here, ooh, I'm noticing that it's hard for me to actually select that little tab in the middle, so I'm going to push this down a layer. That didn't help. We'll push it down another one. Still didn't help. Still didn't help. We'll just push it all the way to the bottom. And now I can grab that little one. That slot is still going to be around the outer border of this piece that I'm cutting out, which means I probably want to just go ahead and subtract it from this. It's only the stuff that are intercuts that I want to leave as separate shapes, because it's going to make adjusting for the kerf of the thickness of the laser a lot easier later on. So I'm going to do Control S, or sorry, Shift, and select both of them. Yep. Did I hear?
Say that again about the what you want to do, what your strategy is on the inner cuts.
Yeah, so let me actually draw that out here, because it'll make a lot more sense when I've drawn it. So if we've got, I don't want to erase this. I'll do it up here. So let's say this is the stroke in our design software. The laser is actually going to cut half of the kerf on this side and half of the kerf on this side, which means it's going to be off. Now the problem comes in when you're dealing, let's say we have a shape like this, some sort of rectangle. And we want this to actually be a rectangle that's that size that we're cutting out of a piece of material. So this is the piece we care about. This is our project. We've made a rectangle, which is a good starter project. The laser is going to cut like this. So are we going to end up with a part that's too small or too big? Well, if this is the piece that we're cutting out of the board, like we want this rectangle, or say we're making a ruler, then it's going to cut a little bit inward of our border. So we're actually going to end up with a ruler that's a little bit too small. But here's the tricky part. If we're actually cutting a rectangle out of another piece, like we're making a rectangle holder, for whatever reason, we actually end up with a hole that's too big. So the way we offset for this is that we either grab, instead of grabbing the center line, we want to grab one of these outer lines. So either the outer one, if we're dealing with a cut that's the outside of our figure, or the inner one, if we're doing a cut that's inside of our shape. So this is what is dictating how I'm choosing to, like whether I'm choosing to leave it as a separate shape or keep it as part of the outer border. Does that make some sense?
It does. I have to see it in practice, but,
Yeah.
but I follow the logic of why it's either too large or too small.
Right. So I'll leave that up there. But you can tell, like, so we're either going to grab the middle one or the inner one, or we're going to grab the outer one, and it depends on whether we're dealing with something on the outside or on the inside of our shape. Okay, so I'm going to grab this, and I'm just going to do a difference again.
Now, when you do that, though, you had talked about giving it a little wiggle space.
Right. So earlier on, I actually changed the width of that a little bit
you
larger.
did. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know if you had changed that one.
But I am realizing that I shouldn't delete this just yet, because I'm actually going to use that as part of my template to make that cross piece. So what I really want to do is duplicate it and now subtract it. So it's not immediately going to be obvious that I've made a difference, but if I was to move, not that part, go back to the bottom, if I was to move this part off, you can see that I've removed that piece. Also makes it a lot easier for me to snap it back on there, because I now have that other shape there. Though I'm still uncomfortable with that, so I'm still going to click undo 2 times and just put it back to where it was. Okay, so moving right along, we basically have the side piece done, sort of, but I'd kind of like to give it some feet. So I'm just going to make some circles. Yeah, that looks good to me. And we'll just try to snap them down here. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit, because what I really want to do is snap the corner. It's not snapping where I want it to be. I want it to snap.
Now, wouldn't you have something coming through at that spot?
Ah, yes. So for part of that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this piece, I'm going to take this one, and I'm going to union them together. So you can see the hole is going to be right here and right here, but I still have this nice little foot.
Okay, it's getting really hard to see.
It's getting hard to see? Okay. Well, let's see what we can do about that. That didn't make it any better. I know it doesn't look like I'm changing anything, but I promise I am changing things.
I know you are, but I'm just wondering if on the video replay if it'll pick it up.
So this feed is going straight to, like, it'll get that on the.
So because you did a union, you've now made that circle part of your A-frame.
Correct. I can undo that if I need to by going to the node editing tool and basically deleting these 2 nodes. I'll show you that just
Would
because.
you be able to do that 10 steps from now as well?
Yes.
Because it's not an undo, you're actually deleting the physical component of it.
Right. Right. So I will be able to do that later on. So if I close Inkscape, I'll still be able to do that. The other option is that I could still make a rectangle. Something like this. And just make sure I'm centering it on the bottom. And do a difference so that I'm basically subtracting it away from that. So I will have options for how to get rid of that piece if I need to. But for now, I actually need to get a foot that's identical on the other side, so you can probably guess what I'm going to do by now.
Draw it from hand. draw freehand.
Exactly. Except I'm going to duplicate it and flip it and union it instead. Now the tricky part is getting two of them. So we're just going to, what I'll do is I'll pull this whole thing out, snap those together nicely, so that now I can grab both of them easily, do a union, and because of that
now
shape,
it's one object again.
now it's one object again. Because of that little piece up here, I should be able to snap it right back in place. So if you can't figure out how to make things work, like you can't select the right thing, just pull it off the thing and make sure there's some way to snap it. You could even do something like adding a rectangle that's temporary just to snap it back in there. Or if you wanted to be really tedious, you could do the transform thing and move it like exactly 2 inches to the side. But I don't know, that feels tedious to me, so I'm going to pass on that. All right? Any objections? Okay. Okay, so we've basically got our shape. Oh, no, we don't, do we? We haven't added those little fillets. Yeah. I think I'm going to go with fillets instead of chamfers, which I've always wanted to call fillets. But no, they totally pronounce it fillet. So don't judge me. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to basically grab a circle, snap it in there. Well, kind of a circle. It's really an ellipse. Then we can control it, mess around with it. But what I'm going to do is actually copy these two, or I'm going to move them out to the side. Because I have a little bit of a challenge. I can't just do a difference that will subtract off just that corner, because it's this little piece right here that I want to get rid of. So what I'm going to use is what we've used before, is actually that division tool, which will basically use that circle as a cookie cutter. And of course I could pull out the circle, but that's very clearly not what I want to do. So I'm going to put that back and just grab that corner, delete it, and union it together again. And then of course I'm going to duplicate it and flip it and cookie cutter again. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Boop. Now this time it didn't give me the extra circle, so I didn't have to union anything else together. So we'll save that, and we'll move it back over here. We're just kind of grossly getting it in place. And we'll snap it right there. So that looks pretty good to me. Like it seems like it'll be easy to slide it down there, but it'll also have like a nice flat area so that it won't wobble all over the place. All right. Okay, so let's save. I'm saving all the time. So for now, just to make sure we get this done, I'm actually not going to add the extra like artistic stuff. But later on we could add that back in. I just want to make sure we get a piece that actually works tonight. So the next thing I'd like to do, we've got two options for things to do. We can make this piece, because that piece is going to need to be cut out. Or we can make these pieces over here, so the side pieces, which will be identical. So we've basically got two more parts to design. Any preferences?
I go from easy to hard. Do the middle piece first.
All right. Well, you'd think that would be the easy one. It's actually not going to be the easy one. But we can do that one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, and I'm going to make another rectangle, which I was trying to snap to the bounding box, but it didn't want me to. So instead, what I'm going to do is actually change this rectangle's dimensions. What I'm basically doing is I'm modeling the spool, but from another side. Does that make sense? Okay, so we said the spool was going to be, it's 2 5/8 wide, so 2.625. This is where it's likely I'm going to make a mistake. Just be ready for that. And 7 7/8, so 7.875. So, and then I'm just going to snap it over here, just because I kind of want them to be aligned, and just use my, that's going to take forever. So we'll just hold control and move it out to the side so it's kind of properly aligned. Then I'm going to take this piece, duplicate it, and also hold control and move it over here. just so that I have it kind of sitting over here. I'm also going to duplicate. Ooh, we don't want those groups. Control-Shift-G to ungroup them. And we're going to duplicate one of these because those are the right thickness of the material. And if you remember correctly, we made that notch a little bit large. So it is no longer the correct size. So I'm going to snap this one up here because that is the top point of that box. And this is the bottom point, so we're going to leave that for now. Or maybe we'll use it to shift in. So we'll grab this and we'll move this edge in a little bit. Oop, nope. You know what, we'll be smart about this. We will click and drag this down till it snaps. And now we've got what we wanted. So I'm going to get rid of this bigger box. Okay. Alright, so good so far. I'm going to duplicate that, hold Control, and shift it over here. I'm not convinced that that actually is in the place that I want it to be, so I'm going to go back to AlignDistribute. I made sure to select the one that I knew for sure was in the right place first, and then center on the horizontal axis. I said that backwards, but we'll edit it in post. Okay, so now we've got this. And actually, this is just going to be a whole big piece, so I'm going to use this new one that I made to just pull one big piece off. So now I just have one piece that is basically my side piece. Now there are a couple things I want to do here. I kind of want this to have a nice fit, so I'd like to add a little bit that extends below this piece. So I basically want to extend this a little bit further down. You'll see what I mean in a minute. So that probably didn't make any sense just yet. So I'm going to duplicate this one, move it down here, snap it there, move this over here, and make it a little bit smaller. That looks good. So that piece will slot down, and it'll feel like it fits better. And I'm going to do the same fillet thing that I did before. First, I'm going to group these, not group them. I'm going to union them so that they're one piece. And then I'm going to do that same circle thing I did before. So I'm basically going to fillet some of these corners so that this piece also slides down pretty nicely in a different dimension. This will make a lot of sense once I actually have it printed out. Just trust me for now, all right? So we'll just snap this in there. It's becoming very hard to see. It's kind of visible, but not perfect. Okay, there we go. One of the disadvantages of having those snaps on is that things will snap to the wrong stuff all of the time. So just be very careful about that. You may want to zoom in a little bit more. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and do the cookie cutter thing again. So we're going to division. We're going to grab the little corner, delete it, grab the two big pieces, and union them. And we're going to duplicate, flip, grab the two together, union. Ooh, something happened. I wasn't supposed to union there, was I? What was I supposed to do?
Division?
Yeah.
Take the piece out.
There we go.
So this piece that you're creating now is going to be like the bridge inside the spool?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Now, I'm assuming that one piece is going to be enough
Okay.
to just hold it and allow it to move
I was gonna say,
smoothly.
it's going to rotate at some point as it pulls the material off. So with that,
I think it's going to be smooth enough, but I could always round it with a little bit of sandpaper afterwards, or I could add some like actual rounded pieces that slot into this later on. So if I need to change the design, I can do that. So that piece is actually, that's it. That piece is done. I might want to double check and make sure that it's still like the right height. Am I zooming in over here? Yeah, that still looks good. So I'm going to undo and put it back where it belonged. But there's a problem. Who knows what the problem is?
Is the cross piece too thick? Is it small enough to fit inside the spool itself?
Well, that's definitely something we should check.
Okay.
And you see,
Sorry.
it definitely fits.
Yeah.
But that's absolutely something I should have checked.
Not long enough.
It's not long enough?
I think it's only going to fit one spool.
It's only
Oh,
going
it's
to
the
fit one
exact
spool.
width of the spool.
It's
Yeah.
exactly the width of the spool. So that's a bit of an issue. So I'm going to duplicate this spool. And I'm going to set this, we'll set it to like the thickness of the, actually we'll set it to like 1/4 of an inch. There's no reason we have to be constrained by the thickness of the plywood here. And I'm going to snap that to the other side. So that then what I can do is expand this so that this node fits at the right place. We'll see how this works, because we're going to have to use the node editing tool, and it looks rather scary when we use the node editing tool. I'm going to click and drag and just select these nodes. I'm going to grab this one. You can see I can pull and push this whole section out. I can also distort it terribly. We don't want to distort it terribly. I was really hoping it would snap here, but it is not snapping there, which is very unfortunate. So
Would it snap too?
and that's the thing. Sometimes it'll allow it to snap if you're holding it horizontal, but
Right.
sometimes not. So instead, what we'll do, I'm going to leave it right there because we're still going to just grab it and pull it off to the side. I'm going to grab this corner and make a rectangle. And unfortunately, it's not snapping to the intersection either. Ooh, fun. All right. So what we're going to do instead, so this is what the fourth change of plan. So I'm going to union these together first. And then I'm going to take the bottom of this, I'm going to duplicate it, and pull this up so that it's right there. And now I have something that I can snap to, because I can snap to that corner. And then I'm going to end up deleting that mess, because I don't really want it. So back to node editing tool, and this is where things get scary. So the node editing tool is terrifying. And it's not obvious, but because I was holding control and used the scroll wheel, I actually just selected a ton of these over here. So be very careful when you're selecting with the node editing tool. You'll quickly figure out that, hey, I selected way too much stuff and things are moving that shouldn't be moving, and you'll click Control Z. So not a terrible problem. Now I can slide this over, and it still doesn't want to snap.
Does it have to do with the, I guess, the layer level that back piece is? Or?
It's possible, but you know what I'm realizing? It really doesn't matter.
You can eyeball.
As long as I make this like pretty close and maybe a little bit in, it's still going to fit really nicely in the part. So it's not what I would have liked, but it'll do. Yeah, that's interesting. I know why, I think. Let's see if I'm correct. When we go to mess with this with the node editing tool, oh no, never mind. I thought it was a rectangle, and so it didn't have quite the nodes, because if you have things that are saved just as rectangles, then you can like round the corners of the rectangles. But it's saved as a rectangle in the file, so that turns out not to have been it. Oh well.
So as it stands now, it's the width of 2 spools plus a couple of quarters of an inch, or
Yes.
1/4 of an inch.
Spool plus, yeah, 1/4 of an inch. And I guess I'll get this really close. Since I don't have any extra supports holding this in at the top, it'll actually be able to deflect in and out a little bit. So I really shouldn't stress as much about this as I am. Sometimes in Inkscape, the snaps start to just act really funny, and you just have to close Inkscape, open back up, and suddenly the snaps work okay. This happens with Inkscape stuff, so just be aware of that.
I think it's the undo that kills it.
Yeah. It gets rid of all of your undo stuff when you close out of it, so be careful. All right, well, let's delete this other piece because we don't need that anymore. So we've got this piece. We've got 2 of the 3 pieces, so we're on the right track. Last is to do these side pieces. So, oops. So remember when I said like you're going to have to send pieces to the bottom a lot? We're going to send this one to the bottom. Then we're going to send this one to the bottom.
Wouldn't this be an opportunity to use layers and put those layers down below so you don't?
Yeah, so especially if you're dealing with something far more complicated than this, like here it's not terribly difficult for me to draw a selection box that just gets the things I care about. But locking the layer so that nothing moves works pretty well. I could be wrong, but I don't think that the snaps work when you lock the layer. So you can't snap to a layer once you've locked it. But I could be very wrong about that. I am frequently wrong. It's a hobby. All right, so I'm going to duplicate this. And I'm going to take this and put it over here, lining it up with the bottom. Actually, I don't need to line it up with anything over here. We're just going to put this as a side piece entirely. But we are going to end up using these dimensions. So I'll take this down here, and I'll snap that on there. Make this like the same height. So we need to get it the same width as that other cross piece that we made, because if it's a different width, they're not going to fit together correctly. And actually, this one is really easy because I'm going to duplicate this again, put it on the other side. Put it on the other side. There we go. Okay. And then all I'm going to do is just grab this middle piece, these side pieces, just holding Shift. I'm just going to union them all together. Ta-da! That was ridiculously easy, right? So very easy to make some of these side pieces. As long as you've designed it the way that I was just designing it. If you're designing it a different way, then it can be a lot harder. Alright. Actually, I think that's pretty much it as far as designing the actual shapes. Let's go ahead and take care of the curve stuff. And then we'll go ahead and give it a print. Maureen, could you go ahead and turn on the laser? That way it'll be warmed up for us.
So you need to duplicate the A-frame and the two side pieces, right?
Correct. So I'm going to do a couple of things. So I'm going to I'm going to move all this. I'm actually going to go ahead and save this as a different name that I'm just going to call Spool Holder Print. This is a common thing that I do. I don't know that it's necessarily a good idea, but it is something that I just do. Because now I can feel free to just kind of delete that part because I don't need that part. And I don't need this part, so I'm going to delete it. And then I'm going to go in here. I don't need these longer pieces, so I'm going to delete those. I'm basically going in and deleting everything that I don't need, like these side pieces. Don't need them. This piece, gone. So now I'm left with just the 3 pieces that I need. And sometimes you have to like duplicate the whole thing and then cut out the pieces you want. So sometimes designs are a little more complicated than that. And now, yeah, so I'm going to actually, before I duplicate the things to make multiple ones, I'm going to deal with the curve stuff. Because I don't want to deal with that twice. Oops. Undo. My mouse doesn't really like this wood for some reason. Alright, so first I'm going to ungroup these. I'm going to, oh, those were already ungrouped. But I am going to grab them all together. I'm going to get rid of their fill so that they basically disappear. Give them a stroke, which we'll set to 0.006 inches, which is roughly the kerf of our laser. And now what I'm going to do is the trick. So I'm going to grab them all again. Probably just shouldn't have deselected them. And I'm going to go to stroke to path. What that's going to do is it's going to take that stroke and it's going to turn it into 2 separate paths, an outer path and an inner path, and it's going to fill in between the two. So the resulting thing is actually not going to have a stroke. It's just going to be 2 paths basically subtracted from each other. So I'm going to do stroke to path, and you won't be able to tell immediately that something's happened, but if you go to the node editing tool, you'll now notice that you have nodes on the inside and nodes on the outside. All right.
So that now means that the laser is going to aim for the center of that? Is that?
Well, so now if I was to try and cut this, the laser would actually see 2 boxes to laser. So it would, if you set it to engrave, it would engrave all the region between these 2 borders, so it would actually look exactly like it looks.
Now you're going to delete the other.
But now, well, which one am I going to delete?
I'm going to delete
Division or subtract?
Okay, so
Not,
what you did was you took a stroke, and did the path, broke the stroke down into 2 parts,
Right.
an inner layer and an outer layer.
Right.
And so the laser, when it reads it, it has a inside, I guess, and a shell.
Right, so if I was to tell this to cut in its current format, what it'll do is it'll cut twice on each of those boxes.
Okay.
And that will not be what I want. So I'm going to do an extra step where I'm going to do break apart, which basically takes that inner path and that outer path. So it kind of undoes some kinds of differences. So like if I was to take a circle and cut another circle out of that circle, and I was to click break apart, it would just re-separate those two cuts, which can be really useful.
Okay.
The reason I did it here is because now I have two separate boxes, an inside box and an outside box, and I could change the colors so it's a little bit more obvious. So now I have an inside one and an outside one. And here, the inside cuts, if this was inside, the laser is going to cut around the outside, so it's going to make the cut too big. The hole is going to end up too big. We would like it for it to be a little bit smaller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the outer one and just keep the inner one.
Because then it gives it that buffer.
Right. Exactly. So it's exactly half the thickness of the laser. So we're going to do the same with this one. We're going to go grab the other one.
So it'll be a nice tight fit.
Exactly. Assuming I have measured everything correctly. Otherwise it'll be a way too tight fit or a very loose fit. Hopefully we'll get a little bit of each. Sometimes you have to zoom in a lot to get just the outer one. And before I forget, I'm going to go ahead and turn these so that they're actually no longer have a fill and just have a stroke, so that it'll default in the laser to cutting. And they're not showing up at the moment. I could make their strokes a lot larger so that they'd be a little bit more visible. The funny thing is I could leave it like this and the laser would still be like, yeah, I know what I'm doing, and it'll cut out exactly what we want because it's still going along the center line of that stroke. So it actually doesn't matter how it shows up. Well, we're not going to leave it like that because that looks ridiculous. We'll leave it like that, which still looks ridiculous, but will work. Okay, now let's do the same thing with this one. So we're going to set the stroke. We're going to give it a stroke first. Not that same goofiness. 0.006 of an inch. We're going to get rid of the fill. And then we're going to go to stroke to path. And then we need to break it apart. And this time we actually want the outer border. So it currently has both of them selected, so I'm just going to union them instead of trying to pick out one or the other. Because it's going to take, like, the inner one is just consumed by the outer one, so I've effectively gotten rid of the inner one.
Got it.
Could have deleted it, but it's a lot easier while they're both selected to just union them. Now I'm going to get rid of the fill again and give it just a stroke. I am going to be careful though, because I want these to be different colored strokes so that I can set them up differently in the laser. So I want them to be separate cut items in the user interface. Alright, now let's just do the same with these. Luckily these are all outer cuts, so this is going to go really nicely. Famous last words. Alright, so let's give it a stroke. Let's get rid of the fill. We don't technically have to get rid of the fill, it just makes it easier to see. 0.006 of an inch. And then we will do stroke to path. We will do break apart and union. And now we'll go back to getting rid of the fill and giving it a stroke, which will also change just to make sure it shows up differently too. And then the last one, get rid of the fill, add a stroke, change the stroke style to 0.006 of an inch, and then we will stroke to path, break apart, and union. And back to just having a stroke, change it again, and get rid of the fill. So there we go. So now we have all those things. I'm going to grab all these together and group them, Control G. That way, when I move them around, they all stay together, because that would be frustrating if they didn't. I'll duplicate it, and I'm going to click it again so that I get these rotation handles. So that I can... Yeah, I guess I could have just flipped it. That probably would have made a lot more sense. And then we can just kind of slide it kind of like that, maybe. This is where the snaps are really annoying, so I'm going to turn off the snaps entirely, because that will frustrate you when you're trying to position pieces. This piece looks like it'll fit kind of nicely up here, but we need two of them, so duplicate. And it won't, maybe it'll fit if I scoot these up a little bit more. It's a close thing, but I'll bet if I move this one down, it won't be quite as close to the thing. Something like that. And actually, I could probably scoot this one a little bit over, like that. you know, if I'm just trying to maximize this stuff, you don't have to maximize this, but like I said, I'm going to end up printing out a bunch of these. And we'll move this over. And now the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just double check, because sometimes when I do those like differences and the unions, I end up with kind of weird shapes where like it said, oh yeah, that was exactly on the line, and so I'm going to just leave it as two lines that take up the exact same space but not really combine the two. So I'm going to just check to make sure that there are only lines where I'm expecting them to be. In particular, I'm going to check where all these tabs are, and it actually looks like it worked out great, because if there was a problem, what you would see is you would see basically a line going across here, something like that. And then that would be a problem. Then you'd have to do the breaking apart, and you'd need to use the node editing tool to take basically those two corners, extend them a little bit more that way, and then union the two again, so that you basically make those two shapes overlap more. It's a shame that didn't happen on this one, because that probably would have been useful to actually see. Okay. Alright, so this is it. This is good to go. So I'm going to go to Glowforge. I'm going to upload this design. Spool holder print.
Was any of this process like material specific? Like with the
So the only thing that was material specific was all the thicknesses that I set. You could say even the kerf of the laser could be material specific, but it's more height specific than
Okay.
anything else. I'm going to set this to thick cherry plywood because that tends to work pretty well. Not sure what this engraved business is. That shouldn't be there, so we're going to click ignore on that one. The rest of these defaulted to cuts. I'm going to move these inner cuts to the top just so that it happens first. The rest of them look fine. There's not a particular reason to have it doing it.
So it does that automatically, just based off the different colors used.
Yeah, so it puts it kind of in a random. Oh, or did you mean
Like
having it default to
breaking
cut?
Yeah, the default cut, it broke apart the cuts very quickly.
Yes,
Okay.
because all of those were different colored lines.
That's cool.
And set them as different items. I'm gonna move this one down a little bit just because I don't know, they seemed close. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is go ahead and put this in the laser. How about now?
Much better.
All right. All right, we'll scoot this all over a little bit. That bottom little piece is a little bit close to the edge, so I'll scoot it up just a tiny bit. Any bets on how long this is going to take?
17 minutes.
Really? 17? That's...
34 minutes.
4 minutes.
Yeah, 4 feels
wow.
pretty right to me. I'm going to go with 5.
I go with 6.
Actually, I'm going to go with 4 in 1 second.
It'll give you an estimation, right?
Yeah, we're planning on having the Price is Right style stuff with how long laser stuff is going to happen. It'll be more interesting with a 3D printer because we can do like what's the estimated time and what's the actual time, because those two are different with 3D printing. Ooh.
That's cool.
Now this piece is a little bit close, but I don't see a way around that, so we're just going to make it happen. Alright, so what do we think? Who thinks it's going to fit together? Alright, a lot of faith in there.
Anything will fit together with enough.
There's a hammer somewhere.
Yeah, everything will fit together.
Outstanding.
Is that a nice click?
Nice click. A little bit tighter, but it's going in. A little more of a friction fit. Remember, there was some variation in the thickness across the board, so that's probably what we're seeing there. We'll try and slide this one in. That one looks like it's going to go nicely. What about this piece? Ooh.
Good.
Sounds good.
All right. Let's see. It's looking good so far. So we'll slide this in there.
Wow.
Oh, this piece sticks out.
Cool.
But that looks like it's pretty
That's
much
awesome.
That is awesome.
You don't have to do anything to the legs. I know you said he clipped it, but it seems like
That's
it's
fun.
pretty-
It's got a little bit of a rock, but you know that's.
He's a character.
It's
And you
the
know-
table that's not.
Version 1.0.
Exactly, it's the table. It's the table's fault. It's always the table's fault. Now, one of the things I probably should have considered was that you really don't want this thing like wobbling all over the place when you're 3D printing, and that as it pulls stuff, the filament into the printer, it will probably pull this towards it. So I may not have actually wanted to do the feet. I may have actually wanted more contact surface with the table, so that I could have added something like cork or something like that to the underside. So that may have been something I would change in the next version of this. If I add other stuff here, it will add more time to that print. So I'm not entirely sure that I really want to add much more here, but if I ever wanted to like brand it or something like that, this would be a great place to cut out a Decatur Maker's head or something like that.
If you wanted it to be more stable, would it have been an option to maybe put a bottom on, give it a little bit more height, put a bottom on, and then put like some weight in it before you put the spool in?
Yeah, that's actually a good idea. That would have definitely helped. It adds a whole level of difficulty of getting the pieces to fit in multiple areas, but it's very doable. That's actually, I had a similar sort of design in the first design seminar where I was making a petri dish. But yeah, this actually worked out, so I'm pretty happy about that. 2 for 2, so the next time it's definitely not going to work.
That's good.
Any questions on all this?
Some of the steps seem at least just counterintuitive. Is that just because I don't think that way yet in the with the way you took the different like particularly when you did the circles for the feet and for the fillets?
Right. So that thinking in terms of adding and subtracting shapes is definitely something that's not intuitive to most people. And that is one of the ways that things like Inkscape or Illustrator are really powerful, and even just general 3D CAD, thinking in terms of, I can think of this as the shape that I'm making, or I can think of it as the piece I need to subtract from the shape I'm making to get that negative space. So I think a lot of that comes down to that sort of thinking, which does take some practice. I wasn't originally thinking in that way, and it definitely took some getting used to. I watched a lot of videos and watched somebody do the same sort of stuff over and over. And actually that trick for adjusting for the kerf was originally presented to me as something that allows you to do perfect offsets. So if you wanted to make a border around, say, a snowman, you have the snowman shape. Well, if you use the offset or outset command in Inkscape, it distorts the shape and looks hideous. But if you make the stroke thicker and you just separate the stroke, it actually turns out to make a great border.
So a thicker stroke, separate the two lines,
Oh, I see it.
delete the line you don't want.
Right.
I'll never remember that.
That's all right. It's going to be on the video.
A question. So if you wanted to, I guess, put a logo or anything on it, that would be more of the engraving function. Does that? I guess my question is, does it? You have to set the power of the laser, so does it cut the wood, or how would that work?
So they do have different settings. So what I'm using some sort of preset stuff that I know just
Here I'm
works
using just-
really well with that 1/4" plywood that I get.
Okay.
But if I wasn't using that, I would need to manually set the power and speed settings on the laser.
Okay.
Let's say I was to change this to an engrave, which would mean it just engraves all of the inside.
Generic settings, but I can also manually control the speed and the power, the lines per inch, which is the resolution, and the focus height, which is, you'll notice that's not really the thickness of the material, but it's close enough, and it turns out it's not terribly sensitive to that kind of thing. And by the way, for those, just a reminder, for those of you on the Glowforge, it does default to doing maximum speed and minimum power, so it'll basically just blow hot air on your material, and you'll wonder why it didn't cut. So that's why. That'll happen to you at some point.
Defaults to maximum speed and minimum power, I see.
On the engrave.
Right. Well, actually, it does it on cut too. So like, watch. I'll change
So then
this.
what did you do to the cut to make it so that it wasn't minimum power?
I did not switch it to manual. So I left it on the proof grade settings, which are basically the preloaded settings. So right now it's on manual, and you can see it'll show up on that left-hand side, it has that 501. But if I was to go back, that switches it back to a proof grade cut, which now it just says cut.
Okay, so it didn't tell us. We don't know what speed and power it's using.
Exactly.
For the proof grade.
In
Well,
the
it's
early
based on
days, they
what-
did say what the power
what
and
the
speed settings
material
were.
is.
Right, so it's connected to the, but it's not telling us what, like when it's thick cherry plywood, it's got a setting for it,
Right.
But,
which it's top secret.
But it's obfuscated.
well, yeah, but
obfuscated.
Kevin's got some cool pieces over there by the Glowforge where you can pick it, they're like,
Oh, the
cheat
little
codes.
calibration
Oh.
swatches?
yeah, there's
The legend,
calibration
okay.
swatches,
Yeah.
so you can go and look at speed and power
Finger
and see
right.
what it did.
Okay.
And those little rectangles, if you wanted to make your own. So if you go on the Slack laser channel,
Mhm.
it's you have to search for calibration swatch, but it'll show up and the file is there. And I've colored each of the things so that they actually show up in order in the Glowforge user interface. So you don't have to like click on one and say like, okay, so where is this on my screen? What power and speed settings? You can just go straight down the list, and it's a lot easier to use. I should double check that it still works that way because Glowforge has changed some things, and who knows, that may have been something they changed, but I'll check on that just to be sure.
It was a few weeks ago, because I brought in a different kind of wood and I ran the swatch,
Okay,
and it was fine.
cool.
I got this better.
So you ran the swatch on that other piece
I,
of wood? to
yeah, I
see-
cut out
yeah.
a small
So the
piece
swatch
of
is a
that wood,
project.
so I
You send
would
something to
know
Glowforge just to
exactly
test it.
what I was
Right,
gonna get.
and you don't. It's something where you manually have to put in like the power and speed settings for each of the little rectangles. But if you're going to use that material a lot, it's probably worth it. Let me see where. I'll bet it's down here somewhere. Calibration. I'm not seeing it. But if we were to search on the laser channel, not the CNC channel. Actually, if we just search anywhere, we should find it. There it is, right here.
Okay.
Click to download. And then we can open it up. And we'll wait for Inkscape to actually open it. Nope. Here we go. So it looks something like this. But all of those are different colors, and it shows up like this is the first item, this is the second item, this is the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, 9, 10, 11, 12. So that you can manually put in, like, for those first four, you could say put them all to 10 power, and then vary the speed across those four. And the next one you could do 50 power, and then vary the speed in the same way across the next row. So it is tedious to manually do it, but right.
And it's a lot cheaper than,
So the point of this is to run it as a test on the product, on the material you're going to be using,
Right.
just to see how it's going to turn out.
Right.
Got it.
And would that be more likely to do that on a engraving than a cut, or would you, because a cut is just a cut, or do you do that on the cuts as well?
I find that I use it more for the cuts than I do
was
for the
gonna say, I
engrave.
use it more for the cuts.
Because like getting the right settings to cut all the way through while still getting kind of a golden brown edge instead of like a charcoal edge, that tends to be the harder thing. Getting an engrave to look decent actually is pretty easy. Maybe one or two tweaks and you'll be at a decent engrave. But cutting, that is hard to dial in. In theory, you could even do like numbers of passes. Like you could do like 1 pass, 2 pass, 3 pass, 4 pass, and then vary the speed or the power on the other axis. So you can use it for a lot of different ways to calibrate.
So how would you use this if you were going to send this to Glowforge?
All right, so I would go here, and I go back and click upload, and I know it's in the downloads folder, calibration swatch. And it's going to say, like, man, your design has a lot of colors in it. I'm like, yeah, I know that. I was the one who made the design. They're all going to default to engraves because you notice that in the design it actually was, they were all shaded in. I probably should change that because most people are going to be tailoring the cuts. So we would just change this to a cut, this one to a cut. I'm just going to change the first 4 to cuts. And you'll be able to see, oh no, you can't see it all. But when I hover over, you can see that the top 4 are a little bit different. They just show those borders. And then here, now we can go to manual, and we could say, like, let's say this row is the 25 power row. And the first speed I'm going to do is 100. Then I could still have 25 power, but the next speed is 200, and then keep doing something like that, where I would basically be able to change. We'll call it 350, still 25. And actually, this takes a lot less time than I remember it taking. So now I've got 4 different settings for that first row, and then I could do the same thing with like 25 power, with 50 power, and with 100 power. But you know, you may end up needing to zoom in more on one particular area. Like you might find that there's a whole region of settings where it just doesn't cut through at all, and then there's a whole region of settings where it cuts through very deeply, but it's all
So
charred.
then you might say, okay, so I'm going to dial in on, 50 power. I'm going to do a 50, 60, and 70.
Right. Yep.
So there is some experimentation as you develop your some experience with the machine.
Right. But this is also a really good way to just get a feel for what the different powers do on the machine. So you can really get more of a gut feel for what you should be using by messing with this.
And typically, would you typically stick with the 1/4" material, or would you ever go to like 1/2 or 3/4 on the Glowforge, or would you be going to the CNC by the time you get to say 3/4?
So for me, I tend to stick with nothing bigger than a 1/4 inch on the laser. But what I have done is made router templates out of 1/4 inch that then I can transfer to much larger pieces using a following bit. So
Right, like that's what I was thinking with the chair. I want to make
templates.
the templates because I typically would do that all on the router.
Right. So that is a good way to do it. And I actually am currently working on making some little dinner platters, like where it has a little tray for food and a hole to hold your beer or whatever beverage you've chosen. And I basically cut out the shape of this, but now I'm transferring it to walnut and using like a bowl cutting bit and all that stuff. So
Now, I've even had to take the tray out, but I was also using that for etching. So I've put cutting boards in there to have logos etched on.
So you took the tray out in order to have it deeper,
Yes.
thicker pieces of material.
But you have to take Kevin's class. Take the Glowforge class.
Which I have.
Yep.
I saw, and Chris had done an awesome cutting board that had that engraving in it that he did as that wedding gift.
Right.
That was really nice.
That may have been a Christmas gift.
Well,
But
he did one as a wedding that was over there when I was the Glowforge class.
Oh.
It was here.
Oh,
Because it
the
had
cutting.
like the couple's name on it and like
You're
I
right.
don't know, a rose or some other kind of wedding-like logo.
You're right. I was thinking of the Seattle map.
He's
That
done a Seattle map.
He
too?
did a Seattle map where he had, it was basically 2 layers.
Oh, that's
So one
pretty
was
awesome.
painted blue underneath, and then he lasered out and then engraved on top of it. So it was kind of a almost 3-dimensional map. It's pretty neat. He's done some cool stuff with it. And his son Evan has also done some really cool stuff. He engraved City of Atlanta map on his MacBook Pro.
Yeah. Right
That is
here.
cool.
It was,
awesome.
it was pretty slick.
Well,
looking.
you got to be brave if you're putting your MacBook in there.
I've seen it, but
Yeah.
I was like, I need the presets. So.
Yeah,
No,
I've seen-
he did a lot of testing.
I mean, I did see on the Glowforge site when they
Yeah.
were doing their demo video, people putting their computer in there. I'm going,
Yeah,
What could happen?
be very careful about alignment because you saw it looked like it was going to fit when we were cutting that, and it did clip a little bit off. And if that happens to go onto your Mac logo, that could be a problem.
That's where you buy old broken Macs and test on those, right?
Right.
Any other questions?
Thanks so much.
All right, yeah, it was fun. Glad it worked.
You're 2 for 2, man.
I know.